Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good afternoon. As always, we invite you to turn on your camera should you feel so inclined. If not, we understand. We make it a habit to be double, triple booked sometimes. I know that is my life, so I understand if you cannot have your camera on. I just really enjoy seeing your faces. And as always, as a reminder, this session is being recorded to be made available on our website. If you happen to go back to our website between today when we are done and into future dates, you'll see that we'll have videos for day 1 through 5 uploaded. We're working on 6, and as soon as that's available, that'll pop up as well. Knowing also that you have access to our running Padlet that has all of the resources that we've referenced in each one of those sessions. Feel free to access those videos, share those out, as well as remaking those Padlets, editing some of the resource lists there, or adding your own to make those useful to your local needs. With that being said, to honor everybody's time, we're going to go ahead and get started. As always, good afternoon from Imperial County SELPA. We bring you this work out of our Improving Outcomes for English Learners with Disabilities grant work funded by CDE and CCEE. It is our pleasure to be here and to share the resources that we've developed in these areas with you here right now, joining us on Zoom and also statewide in other sessions. In relation to today's session and our previous sessions, the resources are all part of a running Padlet, all in one place, so you don't need to be digging in and out to try to find them. They can all be located in the same place. As I mentioned earlier, feel free to remake and share out widely, broadly, with friends and those teaching partners across your hallways, your respective offices, so on and so forth. Again, these resources available for every single one of you to share out with your local PLCs, communities of practices, etc. We also like to know who is here with us. I see that some of you have already changed your little name tag identifiers to include your name, district, COE, or SELPA, as well as your current position. If you would like to use the chat instead, as true supporters of UDL, feel free to use the UDL-ized feature of the chat to provide us with your name, district, COE, or SELPA, as well as position. We're looking to provide you with multiple entry points and engagement opportunities with us today. My name is Vanessa Lopez, and I am a coordinator here at Imperial County SELPA. If you have been here at our previous sessions, you know a little bit about my background, but if you don't, just very briefly, I have 18 years experience in the classroom in both the quote-unquote RSP and SDC setting, as well as being an English language learner coach, an instructional technology coach, and currently serving here at the SELPA with all things English learners with disabilities, adapted physical education, and assistive technology. With me today, we have our team members, Deborah Montoya, Lupita Olguin-Rubio, and Christina Zavala. Debbie and Christina are going to be helping monitor the chat today, but it will be Lupita and myself today sharing information related to aligning and designing instruction for English learners with disabilities. So we are part of the one system of support, and we're found right here in this little corner of California, very rural, very agricultural, right where Arizona, California, and Mexico meet. So very much our demographic, right? English learners, and English learners specifically with disabilities. We are part of the one system in the California state system of support, and we are focused on all things related to English learners with disabilities. And as you can see here on this graphic, there are a variety of other geographic lead agencies, as well as additional resource leads and initiatives that are run by local county offices. So as always, the context is critical, setting our context as to the why, right? So we're talking specifically about the intersection of this particular population, English learners and English learners with disabilities. The numbers tell a tale that is unrivaled as far as helping us set our context as to why our work is important. So knowing that a large swath of our population of English learners. And where it intersects with disability is going to be critical as we use this dual lens to see how it is that we can best support the needs of our students who are dually identified. And as always, we want to make note that the guidance provided within the California Practitioner's Guide, which is our guiding document, our foundational document, are a series of best practices that are not binding except for those areas where statutes, regulations, and court decisions are referenced. With that in mind, let's jump into it. Let's jump into our work that is rooted in the California Practitioner's Guide, specifically Section 3, Educational Programs and Instruction. We took a look already at Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 within Section 3. Today we are looking at Chapter 7, Teaching and Learning to Meet Student Needs. We went through Chapter 5, the development of the IEP for English learners, specifics related to educational programming and access and equity for English language learners with disabilities. Today, it's all about aligning and designing instruction. However, we've taken these 1-hour nuggets of time with you to hone in on those administrator-specific questions. And these are highlighted at the entry point of every single chapter of the Practitioner's Guide. So here for administrators, we will focus on 3 basic questions. How will I know if students who are English learners with disabilities are receiving the instruction that they need? Additionally, what does this quality instruction for English learners with disabilities look like? And finally, how can I support my teachers to provide this instruction, and how will I know if their instruction is effective? Again, 3 questions, but super loaded, super heavy, and super nuanced, as everything in special education is, right? We always say that in special education, it's always an it depends, and there's always multiple ways that we can address a particular situation. However, Chapter 7 really does a good job at framing these decisions, these conversations, and by guiding us with the use of very specifically designed resources that are found in our figures and the appendices to help you take on this endeavor. So very briefly, we always like to pop open the infographic. Chapter 7 infographic is included here. And this infographic gives you yet another support in sharing some of the content that we're going to be covering today. And I say covering because really that's all you can possibly do in 1 hour together, right? We can just go over the surface level, and then you determine based on your individual needs where it is that you want to hone in on. The infographic really allows you to do that. The chapters can be a bit daunting to paginate through and determine what is an area that you need. However, being able to see it visually really allows you to quickly identify what is an area that you want to hone in on. Additionally, every single one of those areas is accompanied by either an appendix, a figure, a table, or a live link that will direct you back into the California Practitioner's Guide to give you more detailed information as you engage in building, your collective expertise at your individual sites. Know that these are available for every single chapter with the exception of Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. So if you want to go back and have a visual recollection of what it is that we covered on the previous sessions, these chapter infographics will be a supportive tool for you to do that. Know that these are downloadable in a PDF format as well as images by block. Should you wish to create slide decks to be able to chunk out the content in either a staff meeting, a department meeting, those are accessible for you as well. Should you want additional supports or ideas on how to use this resource along our other resources, do not hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to connect and make friends. All right. Enough of the info right there with those infographics. Now let's jump into the actual content, the meat of our conversation today. Chapter 7 specifically is all about teaching and learning practices. Also, how it is that we address the needs of English language and social emotional learning progress for our students who are dually identified. With that in mind, we are going to start by connecting the dots. And this is critical, right? Because you're going to be seeing some information that might resonate, or you might be like, you know what, did we not cover this on day 1 or day 2? And the answer is yes, we have. This has been a gradual build to get us to where we are right now, because in essence today what we are doing is we are connecting the dots. We're connecting the dots so we can fully align and design instruction for our dually identified students. And we do that by keeping core tenets in mind, right? Educational benefit, universal design for learning, our tiers of instruction, and comprehensive ELD. And as not a side note, but more of a marquee note, we want to call your attention to the fact that these guidelines, supports, programs, and frameworks remain the same, regardless of specialized supports provided through the IEP process. That meaning that because a student has met eligibility criteria in one of the 13 disability categories, does not mean that they no longer have access to UDL, the tiers of instruction, or comprehensive ELD. These remain consistent and throughout for all students, including our students who are dually identified. So when I talked about educational benefit, we go back to the IDEA principles, right? From free and appropriate public education, evaluation procedures, the IEP process, the least restrictive environment, parent participation, as well as procedural safeguards. And this is all to guarantee access and weave that thread of educational benefit throughout. And one of the ways that we do that is by ensuring that we keep this in mind. This is our North Star, our circles of implementation in relation to English learners and really all students in setting these effective contexts for learning. If we look at this graphic, we see that at the core of everything are the ELD standards. Why? Because it's language, and language is necessary to be able to connect to content in all disciplines, from language development, foundational skills, to be able to ensure that we have students who are ready for college and career, as well as civic life, that are broadly literate, and that are able to then compete and be an integrated part of our future communities and current communities, to be quite frank. So again, these resources available for you to access and go more in depth in these linked figures right here. So going back to connecting the dots, UDL was brought up. It's like, well, what does UDL have to do with all of this? And the answer is a lot. When we are looking at how it is that special education teachers provide instructions, we're consistently playing with multiple means of engagement, representation, as well as action and expression. This is a constant throughout, whether it be through the process of having students participate in the general education environment with some supports built in, whether they be primary language supports, whether they be assistive technology supports, accommodations, resources, etc. We are typically modifying and or supporting and or accommodating how it is that we engage students, how it is that we allow students to represent their new learnings, their progress, and also providing them with ways of having multiple means of action and expression. And also knowing that providing multiple means of representation is also inclusive of what the classroom teacher does, not just as the individual providing instruction, but also how it is that we structure interactions with our students that allow them to be able to connect to the content in a way that supports their linguistic needs, as well as their disability-related needs. Because the end goal, of course, is always that we end up with expert learners. And we know that students with disabilities who are English learners can be expert learners. They can be purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, as well as strategic and goal-directed. But that requires specific supports. And that is what we aim to get at today during our time together. One of the ways that we can ensure that students with an active IEP who are English learners continue to have access and are able to demonstrate mastery is by providing them continued access to tiered supports. The fact that a student has a disability that qualifies them for specialized services and supports does not remove access from the tiers of support. We know that disability categories impact a student's participation in the academic environment in a variety of ways. And whether it is that they qualify for services under eligibility criteria for SLD, specific learning disability, for OI, orthopedic impairment, autism, that is going to have a very specific impact on how it is that they connect with content. And it might be that academic goals and objectives developed within the IEP that are linguistically appropriate, as identified in Chapter 5, might not be covering additional areas of need that are not related to the disability. So tiers of support should be provided for all of those areas if the student is struggling. Special education is a service, not a place. We say that often and loudly because we really want that to stick, right? That just because they are provided this service doesn't mean that it negates access to other procedures, frameworks, guidelines that are established for other students to access. So most definitely a student who is struggling with other academic areas that are not related to the disability may still access those tiers of support to be able to generate data that can ensure more targeted instruction, more targeted intervention, and more data really should there be a reasonable need for additional assessment in other areas of suspected disability. Another component that remains consistent and really remains in place, whether the student qualifies for special education services under any of the eligibility categories, is comprehensive ELD. And though comprehensive ELD sounds like just one type of ELD, it's actually two. And Lupita has touched upon this in previous sessions, but it always merits repetition, right? It's both integrated and designated ELD. She's going to go into a little bit more depth as we continue through our day today, but just as a brief reminder, integrated ELD is given or provided during regular class time. And that is where content standards and ELD standards work in tandem. The focus is content. However, we provide linguistic supports rooted in those ELD standards to be able to give students access to the content that they are learning. Whereas designated ELD is a protected time where those ELD standards are the focal standards. So again, instruction rooted in those ELD standards. Does that mean other activities can't be attached to it? Absolutely not. But the question is always, is what I'm teaching, is the core of this the ELD standards? If the answer is maybe, or oh, I'm not really sure, or you know what, no, it isn't, it's not designated ELD. And Lupita, again, will give us more information, but know that the resources linked here to give you a little bit more information to glean talking points from, starting points for conversations from are included here. And that is the ELD standards, which again, the focal component of designated ELD instruction, as well as the ELD connectors for students who are accessing an alternate curriculum or who have more significant needs where they would need some more scaffolded supports in relation to how it is that they connect with content. So earlier we looked at the graphic where we talked about language being at the core of all content area. And this really helps us also keep in mind that context is critical. Context is important. And one of the important points that we keep talking about and touching upon is culturally and linguistically responsive and sustaining pedagogy. So when we are considering the students that we serve, we've continually talked about manifestation of disability and language development and linguistic supports. However, we cannot gloss over the fact that the students that we work with are individuals, and there are dimensions of identity. No student is monolithic. No identifier is monolithic. When we look at an individual student that we serve, we're looking at culture, ethnicity, disability, race, sexuality, gender. And through a clearly established process that will then take us to a way of us to really fully connect with our students, we must ensure that we are validating, building, and bridging. the VAB framework. So when we recognize that our students have all these dimensions of identity, that they bring these dimensions of identity to our classrooms, that adds yet another layer as we're considering how do we align and design instruction for them, from interest points, from valuing what it is that they bring into the classroom, from utilizing their background knowledge, information, whether it's something that we are familiar or not. They do not arrive at our classroom doorstep an empty vessel. They bring many, many rich background information points that we can actually build upon as we are designing instruction for them. Think about students who have specific life experiences, and when we are providing content area instruction, how is it that they'll be able to connect with what it is that we're sharing if their life experiences don't necessarily connect with what it is that we are teaching? So again, considering those nuanced elements on how it is that we help them build their knowledge and how it is that we utilize their prior knowledge are going to be critical when considering how it is that we present instruction for them. And again, just to highlight the importance of keeping in mind social and emotional learning guiding principles. We have to keep in mind that this is a whole child approach, and that term gets thrown around loosely, and it's important for us to remind ourselves what this truly means, and that this is no easy feat. By no means are we saying that, yeah, just do it, right? Because that's oftentimes what we hear. Oh, if we would just do this, and it's never a just this or a just that. It is a process, but the fact that you are all here indicates that you are willing to move that needle forward and really equipping yourself with holding some of these conversations that will be supportive of the practitioners at your sites and the students that they serve. So another figure that's included in Chapter 7 to really help practitioners at your sites wrap their mind around the multi-tiered system of support for English learners is the Connecting the Dots document from MTSS. This is a fantastic resource for you to engage in conversation with the practitioners that you serve at your site, whether they be general educational practitioners or special education practitioners. The points that are listed here really do take into consideration the convergence of disability and language acquisition. So this document specifically is about California MTSS and English learners with disabilities. We're including it here in the presentation should you wish to engage in a conversation with the practitioners in your field, both general and special education, to give them more of an understanding on how it is that MTSS continues to exist and impact how it is that we serve students with disabilities who are English learners as well. Okay, I talked a lot. So it's time for me to pause and give you a chance to process. So in the chat, please feel free to share with us any wonderings, any learnings, or if you want to pop open that MTSS document, give it a quick read and find something that piques your interest, something that you might want to check back upon, or any of the appendices or tables referenced in this front half of our time together. I will give us a minute or two to do that. And I will pop open the chat. Thank you everyone for sharing your information. Ooh, wow, we have program specialists, psychologists. Thank you for your messages. Agree that UDL 7.4 is really helpful just because it gives us specifics, and it's hard to find specifics in this world of the intersection of special education and English language learning. Earlier, I made reference to linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, and it's really in that world of linguistically appropriate goals and objectives that we look at the impact of integrated ELD, right? Because we are saying that this is a content standard that the student is going to make progress towards mastering at least a component of it. But how is it that they're going to do it? Through linguistic supports. That's what makes it linguistically appropriate. And really, if you want to encapsulate what integrated ELD could look like or would look like, or what the core concept is just that. How is it that we allow students to access content with specific language supports? So if you're coming from the special education side of the house and this is your first interaction with the world of what is integrated ELD, go back to those goals and objectives that are linguistically appropriate. That is a perfect starting point for you to engage in conversation with your case managers, special education teachers, for them to understand the difference between the two. So the work that they're doing to ensure that the student is making progress and make a benefit with those goals that are linguistically appropriate, that is your integrated ELD. The focus is ELA, whether it be reading, writing, or it's math, whether it be computation, et cetera, et cetera. Those linguistic supports provided is what is going to allow the student to connect, make contact, and be able to demonstrate mastery and growth. So that is a very just snapshot of what integrated ELD could look like. Whereas designated ELD would be specific to those ELD goals. And yes, Terry, absolutely. Sped supports like visual thinking tools and assistive technology will help English learners. And I agree also with your last point, all learners in general. I know that in my case, I don't call it AT, I call them life hacks, but I access them all the time for those areas where I fail to be successful. So I have those and I incorporate them in my everyday. Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information, because really what we're attempting to establish here is that as California educators, at our core, we all truly believe that English learners with disabilities are able to achieve all of these content standards, but we recognize that they're going to require specialized supports to do so. And our aim here is to be able to identify what some of those specialized supports might look like. And to be able to do that, we also need to consider how it is that we're setting it up from the get-go, from the very beginning. How is it that we are approaching, how it is that we align and design instruction, not just for those students with a disability who are English learners, but in general, to Terry's points, to support all students. And with that, I am a firm believer of, if somebody else said it better, you be quiet and let them say it. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to let Shelley Moore talk a little bit more about reducing barriers from the very get-go. Here we go.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in about 5 minutes that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore, and today's episode is called Reducing the Barriers, Planning for. Okay, everyone, today we're talking about something very important. Today we're talking about shifting a paradigm. Now, one thing that I'm not sure everybody realizes is that in our efforts to move towards more inclusion and equity in our schools, is that one of the biggest barriers is the actual infrastructure of the existing educational model. You see, me, like many of us who work in education, we were taught how to support students through a special education lens. That is a model where a plan is made for most students and then special support is offered to those students who don't have success in that original plan. This special support then seeks to figure out, well, what's wrong with the student in question, and then offers support in a way by offering adaptations and modifications so that they can fit into the first plan. What if nobody fits into the plan? Because of how we were all taught to support students, as our classrooms have become more diverse, there's been this overwhelming feeling that inclusion is so much work because more and more students need this type of retrofit support in order to be successful. Okay, now listen, I have never met a teacher that can follow more than one plan. So a big question emerging here is, how do we make one plan for all learners from the start so that we can be effective and efficient and then not have to retrofit for all of the learners that don't fit. In order to do this, we need to shift how we think about and respond to students who are struggling. You see, special education evolved out of a medical model. So, for example, like if you break your leg, you go to the doctor and then they fix you. And if they can't fix you, they send you to a specialist. We get medical attention when something is wrong. This is special education. It's designed to react to students when something is wrong. And as a result, our educational system has become so heavily reliant on processes that emphasize failure, expensive evaluations, and intervention systems that focus on the deficits in students. Well, something that we can learn from the disability community is that just because a person is struggling doesn't mean they're broken. People don't need to be fixed. So then how do we respond to students in a way that meets their needs without creating programs and following processes for only targets what's wrong? Well, I will tell you this. We need to move away from the medical model, that's for sure. So what can we do instead? Well, one alternative is to shift towards a social model. In a social model, if someone isn't having success, it's not because they have a disability or because something's wrong with them as an individual, but instead it's because there's something around them in the context that's limiting their success. Now listen, I spend a lot of time traveling, mostly throughout North America, and about 2 years ago I had the opportunity to speak at a conference in Hong Kong. Now I was so excited about this. I've never been to Hong Kong, so my wife and I, we packed our bags and we were ready to go on our great Hong Kong adventure. Well, I was so excited that I didn't really anticipate that I would have different needs in Hong Kong than I do in North America. Typically, I would feel pretty independent in my travels. I would rent a car, I would drive, no problem. I would be able to navigate conversations and menus and directions and be able to find the conference hall that I'm presenting in, easy peasy. But in Hong Kong, I realized I needed much more support to be able to do these very similar things. Like I wasn't able to rent a car. I didn't have the right driver's license. I wasn't able to have many conversations, read menus, or follow directions because there was a language barrier. I also had no idea where I was speaking because I couldn't read any of the conference signs. I needed a lot of support in Hong Kong. Thank goodness the organization who brought me there anticipated this and made 3 Hong Kong days available to me if I needed them. I had a driver, I had a translator, I had a host. But I couldn't help think to myself, like, that's so many resources for one person. What's important to know about this example is that whether I'm in North America or whether I'm in Hong Kong, I'm still the same person. My success and independence in Hong Kong had very little to do with me as an individual and had more to do with the barriers that existed around me. Now, I want you to imagine all the students that you work with, every teacher they interact with, every classroom and school they go to. I want you to think about all these different contexts as possible different countries. Students are the same regardless of where they go. What changes is the context around them, and every context is going to have more or less barriers that can either support or limit success. So how do we support kids this way? Well, first of all, we have to anticipate these barriers, which means we can't wait for students to not be successful. We can't wait for them to fail. Second, we have to stop putting all of our resources into trying to fix individuals. If we move away from this kind of student diagnosis and intervention as the first strategy, it allows us to assess the environment and the context first to find out what's getting in the way. Because the big idea here is this, my friends. The more we support a context to reduce barriers, the less individual resources a person will need to be successful. The social model of support is a foundational understanding to planning for all students and directly connects to universal design for learning, response to instruction, and collaborative models of support. It would be very difficult to try and implement any of these frameworks if we were only looking at students through a medical and deficit-based perspective. Students are not broken. They may need support, but today's challenge is asking, instead, look around the student to see how can we fix the context so that barriers are reduced instead of looking at what we can do to fix a student in their deficit area. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of 5 More Minutes. Make sure you take a look at the 5 More Minutes podcast where we dig deeper into some of these big ideas. Give us a like. Don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of these episodes. I'll see you next time.
Go back a slide for me, Vanessa, please. There we go. That was a lot of information. But first I want to say we are fans of Shelley Moore. We so much appreciate her message, her examples, and the constant reminder of us as leaders and us being at the helm, choosing to be at the helm, and trying to navigate our current educational climate, and taking into consideration that our passengers are of all needs, all types of supports, all types of experiences, and bringing along with them those experiences as well as some pretty heavy baggage, when we consider trauma and just other extrinsic factors that impact learning. So we thought a little bit about what would be an appropriate other voice to share as we were kind of thinking about what video to select to really hone in on what chapter 7 is all about. And really chapter 7 at this point in our sequence for us as administrators is taking into consideration all the different components that led up to chapter 7. And as Vanessa walked you through the slide with the connecting the dots, at the end of the day, the context, our environment, our culture, our climate, how inviting and respectful our current site is, which includes the people, which includes the physical elements of our environment. What message does that send to the students and the families before they even set foot in the classroom? Because that is the number one indicator of how the students will respond. And again, we're not even talking about English learners. We're not even talking about students with disabilities, dually identified students. We're really talking about setting the tone for learning. And so chapter 7 gives us an opportunity to reflect on all of those topics that we referred to in chapters 1 through 6, and really focusing in on the context for learning. There are some critical elements in the context for learning that Vanessa walked us through, all of which fall under the MTSS framework, and that our friend here, Shelley, kind of put together in this neat package. But when we think about addressing the needs of the diversity of learning and how it manifests in our different students, we can paint a broader picture, right? Not retrofit our current system, but create a system to address the needs of all students. And we've shared with you up to this point some research-based frameworks and practices like MTSS, like UDL, like other principles of social and emotional teaching and learning. All of those are research-based. The task for us as administrators is taking stock. First and foremost, what does that look like at my site? What does that look like in my district? What does that look like in my classroom? Taking stock and thinking about a mechanism and perhaps even committees of people who can help us, you, take stock of what's happening, what's not happening. How can we build a rich context for learning so that all of our students can benefit and are primed to learn? As we move into and kind of focusing in on our population of students that we're referring to specifically in these sessions, English learners with disabilities, we do want to take into consideration the resources that are afforded to us specifically for those kiddos. Next slide, please, Vanessa. So with that, we're going to take a moment to really think about that unique population of students with this question. And just feel free to drop in the chat your response. And we're going to move a little quickly here because I'm taking note of the time. So do our English learners with disabilities absolutely need to have designated ELD? And go ahead and switch to the next slide, Vanessa, because I think if you've been with us at least for the last 2 to 3 sessions, I should expect to see the answers that I'm seeing flooding in the chat right now. Yes, the answer absolutely is yes. So yes, all English learners, next slide please, including English learners with disabilities, must receive both designated and integrated ELD, what we know to be in the state of California as comprehensive ELD, not either or, but both. And so in order to successfully, effectively do that, we absolutely need to make sure that our staffs, our teachers, anybody who is interacting with our dually identified students is familiar with using the ELD standards, designing activities and lessons, and implementing the principles of the ELD standards in their instruction. you can't have ELD instruction without the ELD standards, right? At least not to up to par, at least not to be able to provide access, at least not to be able to make sure that we're providing the appropriate linguistic and grade level supports for our students. It is a requirement, not a nice thing to do. So again, taking stock, right? Before we start talking about what does integrated ELD look like, let's take stock and find out, do our teachers need more support in understanding these resources, the ELD standards, before we start asking them to implement some best practices, creating lessons. Let's take stock. Are they familiar with the ELD standards? Are they able to use them to design lessons? And if not, then let's talk about that first and provide the appropriate supports that perhaps our staffs may need before we ask them to implement a new strategy or go systems wide with adopting a program, again, compromising at the core what we all need to be able to know, understand, and use, which in this case are the ELD standards. Next slide, please. And touching back on linguistically appropriate goals and objectives for dually identified students. Because our linguistically appropriate goals are not ELD standards, we covered that a couple of sessions ago. They are not ELD goals because, again, the fact that you're an English learner does not qualify you for special education. However, the fact that you're an English learner does require us to address your linguistic need along with your disability-related need together, not separate or not in lieu of, but together. You're an English learner with a disability. I've identified your disability category and how it manifests in your learning. And so my goal is going to address that as well as your linguistic need because you continue to be an English learner. And again, not a nice thing to do. It is absolutely a requirement. Next slide, please. So again, we can't say it enough, right? For those of us in the back, can't say it enough. Comprehensive ELD is part of Tier 1 core instruction. It is not an intervention for any English learner. Might an English learner, whether he or she has a disability, need some further support in English language development? Yes, absolutely. That is very possible. Perhaps a student may need some additional support in their writing or reading or both, especially when we talk about long-term English learners who may need some additional extensive support in language development, specifically in their reading and writing. That's not a characteristic of special education need, rather an intervention for ELD, similar to the need to have an intervention for language arts or an intervention for mathematics, separate, different than special education services. But again, all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, must receive comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated, along with their disability-related need. Next slide, please. So we're going to walk you through in just a few minutes and give you some resources to explore at your leisure. Some resources within Chapter 7 to, again, help us think about what do we need to take stock on, right? So here's this resource 7.9, which are some framing questions to help navigate through the conversation about whether or not our teachers may need some additional support with the ELD standards. So how familiar are teachers in identifying the student's proficiency level? Are they familiar with the ELD standards and the organization, and how might they use them to address the student's proficiency level? And as a result of that, are teachers familiar with identifying oral language barriers as well as linguistic barriers to be able to provide appropriate strategies for students as they present challenges in their learning? Back to the ELD standards, interacting in meaningful ways is what you see underlined there on the slide, because that is one key component of the ELD standards. Are teachers providing opportunities for students to interact in meaningful ways? There's a whole set of standards dedicated to just this concept. And are there different types of scaffolding accommodations and modifications being offered to the dually identified student as per his or her identified disability as well as their linguistic need? So you notice that I posed the question more for you to be asking your staffs. in the slide is designed for teachers to use in designing their lessons. But again, on this idea of taking stock, if your teachers are having a difficult time identifying the cluster of standards that they're going to use, if you're not seeing students interacting in meaningful ways, if teachers are having a difficult time identifying proficiency levels, those are red flags, folks. Those are things that we need to investigate a little bit further so that we can provide the necessary supports that our staffs may need, which may mean training, which may mean more collaboration time, which may mean taking a step back, looking at the resources and really providing time for teachers to be able to plan, to become familiar with the standards and work together to design specific lessons for dually identified students based on their unique needs. Next slide. And again, EL services are in companion with the disability related services. So yes, we are speaking a lot to the linguistic needs, but not to put aside the other unique needs that are specifically related to their disability. So again, things like the need for assistive technology, the different types of equipment that a student may need. Is the student visually impaired or deaf or hard of hearing? Are there some behavior needs that we want to take into consideration? Again, this slide is really to emphasize that it's both, right? The linguistic need and the unique disability related need. And so again, we want to take into consideration the very unique needs that these students have and provide the appropriate supports. Next slide, please. Another resource that we want to share with you is this recommended teaching and learning strategies. This is actually 6 different areas. What we see on the slide is one of them, leveraging background knowledge. And I took the liberty of highlighting some key concepts within the different strategies for this area, leveraging background knowledge. And I think as you kind of skim down the slide, you'll notice that, You'll notice that primary language is underlined a few times. So the role of primary language is absolutely critical for an English learner, especially if that English learner is a Spanish-speaking English learner. Next slide, please. Oops. Did we go ahead a few slides? Let me see, go back one. There. Oh, okay. All right, you know what, Vanessa, I added a slide and I think if you can refresh it real quick. Thanks for your patience, folks. So the role of primary language is absolutely critical. So using primary language does not mean, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean direct translation of everything that you're saying in a language other than English. Basically, it's an opportunity to tap into what the student may already know and understand about English as it relates to their primary language. There we go. Thanks, Vanessa. And so again, here are some ideas to think about in terms of the role of primary language to support an English learner's needs. Perhaps explaining instructions, not verbatim, but just some key features of the instructions, or at the very least checking for understanding in the student's primary language. And if you are not a Spanish speaker or if you're not familiar with the student's primary language, this is where I often say students are each other's primary scaffold, where we can ask, check with your partner, make sure that you understand what the next steps are. So again, the use of primary language is an instrument that we underuse and sometimes don't use because of our philosophy or because we think it's cheating or we're taking away from the student by having them tap into their background knowledge, which in this case is primary language.
So let's see.
Oops, somebody's thank you so much. Okay, so again, written translation, sometimes you can have access to electronic resources that the students can use to help them translate. Again, we're taking into consideration the gamut of proficiency levels from students who are very limited in their English skills to students who are moving along the language proficiency ladder, if you will, and may need a different degree of support. Paying attention to and calling out and using cognates. There are a range of cognates between English and Spanish. And so we want to be able to point them out to the point where students are able to recognize them in text and in writing. And again, helping students feel comfortable and value their primary language, and allowing them some time when in collaborative conversations to engage in discussion using their primary language to flesh out their ideas. Doesn't always have to be formal English. At the beginning stage of brainstorming, at the beginning stage of processing new information, it is completely appropriate and effective to provide students opportunities to engage in a dialogue where the language is less formal and academic and more of social in nature, and of course being able to use their primary language to flesh out their ideas and have a better understanding of their new learning. So again, the role of primary language is absolutely critical. Next slide. And just to tap into accommodations and modifications, we're going to look at figure 7.11. But before we move into that, I want to highlight these 4 areas that are absolutely critical in helping us craft and provide a context for learning that is absolutely effective for our dually identified students. We want to make sure that when we are looking for taking stock or providing support for our staffs, that we are looking for these 4 elements, that the principles of universal design for learning are being implemented. So question for ourselves, how well informed or trained are our teachers in this area? That we're using evidence-based instructional strategies, that whatever we decide to do systemically, graphic organizers, language stems, that is based on research. And so we're providing time and energy and resources on a strategy that is research-based, that the materials and the educators are culturally and linguistically responsive, that we are, again, the context for learning, valuing our students' assets, that our approach is an assets-based approach rather than a deficits-based approach, and that our students feel welcome, respected, and valued. We're going to whiz through the next slide, which is another resource from chapter 7. And this is, again, a resource that you can use to help you take stock. But as you move forward in implementing accommodations for your English learners, it's absolutely critical that you, as you are choosing the accommodations, that you're taking into consideration your educational specialist, your general education teacher, your special education teacher, the student, and the family when you're deciding on which accommodations to implement, when, where, and how. Again, we want to take this comprehensive approach so that we ensure that we're providing the types of supports that the student needs, that the student finds useful and beneficial, so that, again, we're able to meet the very specific goals that we've identified for him or her on the IEP. Next slide. Again, really important, big and bold, the accommodations do not reduce the learning or performance expectation. They're a workaround. They are a workaround for our dually identified students so that they're able to access the content and engage fully in the content along with their non-disabled peers. So don't be shy about including or implementing accommodations at the risk of thinking, we're compromising a content. You're not. It is absolutely what Vanessa calls a life hack that we all benefit from, right? So again, don't be shy about including them in your goals and implementing them as we move forward in addressing the needs of our kiddos. Next slide. And as we are rounding out the corner for our hour today, and I think I'm going to make it, we want to be able to highlight a student scenario. And we don't have time to explore it together here today. But again, it's a student scenario. This is Mateo. He is a middle school kiddo. And when you read through Mateo's scenario, I want you to keep in mind the 3 questions that Vanessa pointed out earlier today, because this is an exemplar. The Meet Mateo scenario is an exemplar of everything that we've talked about in chapter 7 and everything leading up to chapter 7. And so as you are reviewing this scenario, perhaps you want to share it with your staff. I want you to be thinking about these 3 questions. How will I know if students who are English learners with disabilities are receiving the instruction that they need? What does quality instruction for English learners with disabilities look like? And how can I support teachers to provide this instruction? And how will I know if the instruction is effective? So as you are exploring the scenario, be thinking about these questions, because you're going to see examples that can support what it might look like for you, for your staff, and at your site. Next slide, please. So this is the actual scenario. Again, it's both in the slide deck as well as in the Padlet, so that you can review it. And again, know that this is an exemplar. And I think we have one more slide before we close shop and give you some time to debrief with us or ask us some questions. Again, folks, as leaders, as educational leaders, I want you to think about, before you move forward and implement, take stock. Take stock of what's happening, what's not happening. What do you see? What would you like to see enhanced? What are some areas that your teachers may need some additional support, whether it's in UDL or the ELD standards, or perhaps a little bit of both? And more importantly, folks, how are we intentionally providing opportunities for our general education and our special education practitioners to work together and lean on each other and build on each other's areas of expertise? So again, we leave you with this quote again from chapter 7. It is a shared responsibility. So in the spirit of a collective commitment, we want to have you think about bringing in a specialist to our part 2 of this chapter. Chapter 7 is 2 parts. So next time we come together, I believe it's December the 7th, we ask you to consider bringing maybe your EL lead or your EL TOSA or your general education coordinator or literacy coach. So depending on who you are and what your focus is, think about who might you invite to part 2 of chapter 7, as we are, number 1, taking stock of our learning environment and context for learning, as we are exploring the MTSS tenets, UDL, comprehensive ELD. Who might you want to bring to this place to dig a little bit deeper on these different components of providing effective support for our English learners with disabilities? And I think we have one more slide after this, Vanessa, and just a couple of minutes. So if you have any lingering questions, or if you have any final thoughts as we close up our hour together, again, we want to thank you on behalf of Imperial County SELPA and our Senior Director, Dr. Deborah Montoya. We want to thank you for joining us and sharing your time and your insights. We look forward to seeing you next time to dig a little deeper into chapter 7 and bring a friend or 2 so that we can start building those bridges between our silos. And on